Welcome all to this masterclass on carbon markets in agriculture, US and EU perspective. What is actually the economies for farmers and the climate effects of cultivating the land climate friendly using the latest technology and the market? The answer is far from simple, not least because a clear and transparent framework has not been agreed upon in either the US or the EU. But this masterclass, set up by the American Embassy in Denmark and the Danish networking platform for Farmbrella Group, will try to give the participants and sooner on or later on the video viewers some long-awaited answers. We have gathered experts from both sides of the Atlantic to make us all wiser, and afterwards we'll have some insights from agtech companies on how this carbon farming can be done precisely, how efforts can be measured, and so on. And at the end, we'll have a panel discussion led by Nick Shamrock of Dune Insight. Our program today is that in 2 minutes' time, Martin Vargaard, Thorsoe, assistant professor at Aarhus University, We'll talk about some of the framework being worked on in the EU to outline new common regulations for the carbon market. At least that's what I think we'll hear part of it. Afterwards, we have Jordan Shockley, associate extension professor at the University of Kentucky, who will talk about what's really in it for the farmer. Does farmers actually earn money from the carbon market, and how is the carbon market functioning in the US at this state and time? Then we have CEO of Earth Optics, Lars Dyrud, who uses ultra geomagnetic pulsations to see how much carbon is actually in the soil. That'll be very interesting to hear. Then we have just Knauer of Reseed. Using technologies and data to make decisions for a better future. After that, Jennifer Hanser of the Danishly founded Agrina on how they work in the carbon market. They started out in Denmark and have moved on to the US. And then Nick Shamrock, managing director at Dune Insights, will lead a debate on where this is all going and probably give us an insight into how Dune Insights look at the carbon markets. What can we be awaited in the future? But now I'd like to give the word to Martin Vargaard Thorsoe, assistant professor at Aarhus University, who will talk about carbon farming schemes in the EU and the framework for carbon markets in the EU. Please, I'll stop sharing the screen, and the screen is yours, Martin. And just to make sure, in the end, Patricia Dahl of the US Embassy in Copenhagen will follow up and wrap it up at the end.
Brilliant. Do you see my screen now in presenters mode?
Yes, please. It's fine.
Yes. As Jakob said, I'm Martin Thorsoe from the Department of Agroecology at Aarhus University, where I work with farmers' decision-making and policy design. And for the last 5-6 years, I've been working a lot on soil policy in an EU perspective, working in different European projects on soil, and in the last couple of years, especially focusing on soil carbon, which has become a major topic in the EU, of course. And just to outline what I'll talk about today is, first of all, give you a bit of perspective on the whole EU policy context with respect to carbon farming. And there's a lot of discussions going on at the moment where there's this carbon farming framework that's upcoming will be presented in December. And then I'm coordinating a project under the EDP soil framework called Road for Schemes, where we look into experiences with existing carbon farming schemes across Europe. And I'll present some initial findings from that project. and some of the lessons learned. What are the opportunities and barriers for designing effective schemes for carbon farming, sequestration, and prevention of emissions? But first of all, a look at European soil policies. And I think it's actually quite interesting, because there's been a dramatic shift over the last couple of years. For 20 odd years, soil policy has been more or less neglected in the European context. But after the update of the soil strategy in the beginning of 21, there was a link between sort of soil policy and opportunities for meeting reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And the overall strategy sort of outlines that there's a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% before 2030, by increasing sequestration in organic soils and also preventing emissions, especially from peat soils. There's a target of removing 310 megatons CO2 equivalents in the land sector and ensuring climate neutrality by 2025. So this is quite an ambitious target. And the Commission has set in motion this sustainable carbon cycles framework, where there's over the last couple of years been a series of discussions, webinars, and different kinds of legislation proposed that will sort of assist the member states in curbing emissions from soil and also in enhancing carbon sequestration. There's an upcoming framework for designing carbon farming schemes and also for certifying carbon removals, which will be announced this year in December. And we are all sort of waiting on how that turns out, because that will really outline the playing field for the different carbon farming schemes that we can see and imagine in Europe. And this summer, there was also the proposal for a nature restoration law. And I think it's also quite important in relation to this discussion, because they propose to restore 30% of all peatlands within the EU by 2030 and 70% by 2050, of which half should be rewetted. So there should be quite a dramatic land use change with respect to peat in Europe going onwards. And also, if we look at this from a Danish perspective, this is a very important policy, because we are focusing on trying to convert the land use of 100,000 hectares of peatland by 2030, and that's more than half of our peatlands. So it's also a big focus here nationally. But I'm not going very much into the national discussion, because there's also I think a lot of Danish people in the audience, so that's perhaps not so interesting. But looking at carbon farming and how that's defined in an EU framework, the definition is that it's a green business model that rewards land managers for taking up improved land management practices, resulting in the increase of carbon sequestration in living biomass, dead organic matter, and soils by enhancing carbon capture and or reducing the release of carbon into the atmosphere. And I think this notion of a business model is quite important to emphasize. And in a lot of these Commission documents, it's also emphasized that we shouldn't achieve carbon farming only by pouring in a lot of public money, but there's also the ambition that the business sector should contribute in various ways to this carbon farming, and especially in these carbon farming schemes. There should be money from industry, from different sectors that should be spent for sequestering carbon in farmland. And the Commission has outlined these 5 different practices that they are sort of focusing on when they talk about carbon farming. First of all, afforestation, different kinds of management practices like conservation, agriculture, catch crops, application of biochar, management of wetlands by rewetting and also implementing paludiculture, agroforestry, and converting land use, especially focusing on increasing the area with the permanent grasslands, and carbon farming schemes. The way we define it in our project is a scheme that is any sort of voluntary agreement in which a farmer or a group of farmers commit themselves to apply carbon farming measures in return for a payment in any form. And there's a range of different initiatives around in both Europe and beyond. I've spent the last 3 weeks in the Netherlands, and they're quite more advanced than we are here in Denmark. But we also have some solutions that are coming about. And in the project that I'm coordinating, we have been taking stock of different schemes in a European context, and we have identified 170 schemes that are currently in operation. And I will present a few of these schemes in a bit, and some of the main conclusions from this study. But first of all, if we look at carbon farming schemes and also the way it's defined by the commissions, there's different ways that this is organized. First of all, that there's an organization where it's primarily based on public money, that it goes into typically activity-based schemes, like we see under the Rural Development Program, where there's a payment for establishing a particular hectare of catch crops or whatever. And then there are schemes connected to the supply chain, for instance, and a dairy that goes in and support its farmers in adopting carbon farming practices. But there's also various forms of voluntary carbon markets, where there's an intermediary or a certification body in between farmers and buyers that works to certify carbon removals and also manage this profit that is exchanged between buyers and sellers. And in the Road for Schemes project, we're trying to assess what are the strengths and weaknesses of the current scheme design options that are currently available to European farmers. We also assess stakeholders' perceptions of different strategies for carbon farming. And we will also, towards the end, outline a roadmap for local and regional implementation of this EU framework that will be announced in December. But we have worked on this project for the past 10 months. So we're not so far ahead, but we have made this initial stock takes of different schemes, and I'll present some of the findings from this. And based on these nearly 170 schemes, we can see that half of what we have identified are private schemes. There's also a range of public schemes, and working with a number of different land uses, afforestation, managing grasslands, especially on peat, is quite important. And then there's a range of schemes that also offer different kinds of diverse solutions to farmers, which I think is quite interesting, because that also allows for farmers to adopt their farming practices towards whatever is most suitable for their production system. There are both what we call activity-based schemes, like I introduced before, but there's also a range of schemes that are result-based. And they're quite important, because this is how the Commission plans to design some of these schemes going forward. When you have a result-based schemes, you're rewarded based on the extent to which you sequester carbon in the soil or remove soil, and that puts the attention a bit away from the activity itself, but focuses on the outcome of the activity. And in many respects, it provides a new incentive for the farmer, which is to achieve the result rather than just performing an activity. And we have talked a lot about this also in a Danish context, focusing on targeted regulation and sort of putting the effort where it has the biggest outcome. So that's really promising, and we are doing a more in-depth study of these different result-based carbon farming schemes at the moment. In terms of certification, labeling, most of the schemes that we have been looking at have some form of certification, or at least some specified requirements for how you can quantify the outcome of these different schemes. And I think that's also quite important in order to, at least if you want to connect a payment to these different kinds of schemes, it needs to have a trustworthy certification mechanisms. And if it's not trustworthy, then it easily ends up degrading the whole trust in this system. And I think for the moment there's also a range of very diverse opportunities for making these certifications. So I think it will be also good when we have a more fixed idea about how we can design these kinds of schemes, because that will make it more sustainable to develop these kind of schemes, and also as an investor have more trust in the actual outcome of these investments. Some of the lessons learned from this initial stock take, we can see that most of the initiatives that we have not covered are in the northwestern part of Europe, which is not very surprising. And if we look towards the northern region and Scandinavia, most are also based on public payments. But there's quite a lot of activities that are popping up at the moment, especially in the context of different value chains in the agri-food sector. There's a plethora of different scheme design options currently in use. And when we talk with these different scheme holders, they all sort of have a lot of considerations about how to design these schemes that are very similar across different schemes, but there's not a lot of exchange of experience across different schemes. So I think it's very nice we have an event like today, but also some research projects that can provide some experience collection from these different schemes, because there's a lot of need for that. There's a mix of public and private investments. I think that's quite interesting, actually, because if we have looked at European policy making, it tends to sort of be based on some directives that come from EU, but with respect to this carbon farming, there's a lot of private initiatives that are also sort of influencing the policy agenda. And that's quite interesting to see this mix, and also to bring in this private investments into this carbon farming framework. There's primarily a focus on soil carbon, which I think is a bit of a shortcoming, because we really need to focus on the total emission of greenhouse gases. And I think that's something that we need to address also in this framework going forward. Yeah, I'm just checking the time. I think it's okay. Just briefly, some of the challenges that we see. There's a need for fast action. There's a need for addressing the cost efficiency. We can easily design some very complex monitoring systems, but if they're not also cost efficient, then it won't work. There's a need not only to focus on offsetting, where different kinds of companies pay for activities in the farming sector, and then that counts on their carbon reports. But I think especially within the agricultural and food sector, there will be some targets going onwards that needs farmers to focus on also having some emissions that belong to the sector. Addressing fairness of initiatives, not only rewarding farmers that are taking initiative today, but also farmers who have worked for a number of years preserving carbon stocks should be rewarded. There's a need to focus on the permanence of these initiatives, because I think that's also a lot of the practices that are about. They maybe have an effect in 10 or 15 years, but it's not a permanent effect. Some of the opportunities that we see is that there's a growing market for these kind of carbon sequestration and also buying credits. Among stakeholders, especially farmers, there's a growing interest for adopting some of these sustainable land management practices. And there's a range of co-benefits also of carbon farming that I think is very interesting for the farmers as well. So this was my sort of a short overview of this, and I'm happy to sort of expand on some of these points if you're interested. But otherwise, I'll leave the floor to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin Thorsoe. At the end, we'll have a panel discussion led by Nick Shamrock of Doon Insight. So we'll get back to some questions, but just as Jordan Shockley puts on his presentation, I'd just like to ask you that bettering the climate, that's a global task. Do you and your European partners talk to, for instance, American scientists on this, or is there, or can you find is there a global scene to discuss this matter, the carbon schemes?
There has been some seminars across, but I don't think there has been that much exchange. And in this stock take that we have conducted, we have also looked into carbon farming schemes from Australia and from the US. So we have tried to sort of also collect some of the experiences, but not so much contact with the research sector, I think. And I think that also has to do with the different funding bodies, because when we have European projects, we mainly work with the European researchers, but yeah, there isn't always too much funding for inviting participants from overseas into these projects. So mostly it's informal contacts.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll get back to you, Martin, later on in the panel discussion. And now, Professor Jordan Shockley, I'm very much looking forward to what's the economics in carbon markets for the farmers in the US. I know that's something you've been really looked into.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes, we can.
Audio's perfect. So thank you for the opportunity to come speak with you this morning here in the United States. I'm going to provide an overview of kind of the general structure of the US carbon markets, but also touch on two other topics. One is really the economics from the perspective of the farmer, and then some regulatory policy challenges that we have here in the US that might be of benefit for everyone on the meeting today. There we go. So I guess to start off from a broad perspective, there's really, think about two types of carbon markets that are out there around the globe. One of those is the compliance-based markets, and the other ones are voluntary markets. And that's important because if you look across the globe and you see these markets and how they've developed, most of them on the global perspective are compliance-based markets. However, here in the United States, most of those are voluntary-based carbon markets and voluntary-based carbon programs. And so what's really driving these carbon markets in the United States? Two main things. It's basically corporations. Some of you, even over in the EU, have probably seen some of these pledges by global corporations claiming some sort of net zero carbon emissions or carbon targets. And why are they doing that? There's two main reasons for that. One is driven by consumers, right? Especially here in the United States, we're seeing a change in consumer preferences for products and services that are more environmentally friendly. And then also shareholders, right? Our shareholders for these companies are demanding that these companies have some sort of sustainability reporting measures. And so these really are the two main drivers. What we're seeing here in the US, but again, most of these companies are global and operating in the EU as well. And so why are we even thinking about voluntary carbon markets in the agricultural space here in the US? Well, roughly 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the US come from the agriculture sector. And so there's been a focus on this sector to basically sequester carbon and generate carbon credits for these voluntary market participants. And so how is this market developed? What's the general structure at a high level here that we're seeing in the United States as far as the development of these carbon programs? I like to break it down pretty simple. Let's just say there's a seller. So I call it Shockley Farms. I'm a farmer. I get approached by an aggregator or an intermediary type company. Most of these are private companies that come to an area and try to aggregate carbon credits. for farmers. These aggregators will make payments to farmers for adopting practices that sequester carbon. The two main practices in the US that these carbon programs are paying for in the row crop agriculture space is the adoption of cover crops and the adoption of no-till production agriculture practices. Okay, so the majority of these carbon programs, those are the two practices that they are paying farmers to adopt. Okay, and then these aggregators pay farmers to adopt the practices. They then have ownership of the carbon credits, in which they in turn validate to some sort of level of standards, to then turn around and sell those to a buyer like one of those Fortune 500 companies that have claimed net zero emissions or want to become net zero in the future. So at a high level, this is how the structure works in the United States. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, for it, especially in an area like Kentucky, we are the home of no-till farming. And so a lot of our producers have been practicing no-till agriculture for over 50 years. So all of those farmers are basically not eligible to enroll in carbon programs because of the additionality concept. A lot of these aggregators are requiring new and different practices to adopt and will not pay for continuation of practices that have been done over a long period of time because they've already sequestered that carbon in the soil. And so it's something important to keep in mind of those limitations. So what are the economics? What's kind of the payment structure that's being offered to farmers here in the US? Those ranges, most of them are outcome-based payments where the activity that's getting adopted is then being measured in some form or fashion of how much carbon is sequestered in the soil. And those payments are based off of basically 1 metric ton of carbon or 1 carbon credit, and that ranges from 15 to 25 US dollars per metric ton CO2 or 1 carbon credit that's generated. Now, what's important is there's many aggregators in this space paying farmers, and again, the value on how much they pay ranges. As you can see here, the payment structure ranges. They may be paid over a 3-year time frame. The contract lengths of how long these farmers have to sign up can be anywhere from 3 years to 100 years, depending on the company. Most of those average 10-year contracts. Some of these companies are not only offering basically a dollar payment, but also paying in cryptocurrency instead of dollars. And it's their own cryptocurrency that they've developed. So again, there's a lot of different variations on how farmers get paid in the US. A quick example to give you an idea, an example farm in my state, if they were to convert to no-till, they will basically sequester about 1.6 metric tons per hectare, which is, given that price range, is 24 to 40 US dollars per hectare payment per year. If they adopted winter cover crops, you can see that price range from $15 to $25 per hectare for that practice. However, if you look across the US on average, you can see how much each one of those practices can generate. Again, pretty low on the spectrum, even Kentucky is on the high side, above average in the US for sequestering in this example. So one of the concerns from my standpoint is the pricing itself. You ask any farmer in our state or even in the US if they can adopt any of those practices for the prices that are being offered, and it's no, right? So not only will these payments not cover the direct cost of implementing these practices, they don't cover the indirect costs that are associated with the practices that are being paid for by these aggregators. And one of the things that we're seeing is the risk element. We have issues with, given these practices that are being paid for, there is a risk to the cash crop that's involved, and large reductions in yield that are typically not covered in a payment fashion by these aggregators. And so, from my perspective, the price and the risk is just, it's not here in the United States right now. We need to see higher prices to be able to cover direct and indirect costs from adopting these practices. And so, I was asked to talk about regulatory challenges here in the United States. The biggest one is there are no regulations. Many of you all may have heard, here in the US, it's the Wild West when it comes to carbon credits, carbon markets. Every one of these carbon programs that are being offered to farmers are completely different. How they verify if it's a carbon, how they verify how much carbon is sequestered in the soil is completely different. Some don't even measure. It's a practice-based payment. There's various different forms of quality of carbon credit that's generated. And to be honest, some of these programs are just not, it's concerning, and it's a huge risk to a producer. And so what you are seeing is some discussions at the federal level on the development of some sort of standardization through Congress with the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which basically uses the U.S. Department of Agriculture to provide some sort of standardization on the validation of a carbon credit. If those are familiar with kind of think about USDA certified carbon credit, like they do on the meat sector side of things. Another thing that's working its way potentially through the federal government is through the Securities Exchange Commission. And basically that is an act that is an attempt to protect investors so that if a publicly traded company claims scope 3 emissions or reductions, scope 3 emission reductions, that means that any emission reductions at the farm level, that they have to prove that, and that burden will be then placed at the farm level for farmers to burden the cost to prove for that company that those claims are correct from investor standpoint. And so there's a lot of discussion going around this, and hopefully there's some concerns, as you can imagine, from farmers and farm advocacy groups about this act. And so keep your eye on that and how that evolves going forward. And so with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll be sticking around for Q&A and roundtable and all that good stuff. So try to provide a U.S. perspective on that as much as I can from carbon market space here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan Shockley. And whilst Lars Dyrud get ready to present, you call the U.S. carbon market the Wild West. Do you have contact with the European colleagues on some of the regulatory processes going on in Europe, or or is it really seen? Is it very divided on both sides of the Atlantic?
I think it's divided. I think from from the U.S. perspective, they want minimal government involvement in these carbon markets and minimal regulatory requirements in these markets. There is a huge push to continue these as voluntary markets and let things work themselves out. And it's very hands-off. Now, again, there may be some slight roles of how regulatory, for example, the Climate Solutions Act with some standardization. That's as far as I see this going, and that's why there's so much pushback from producers on the other act from the Security Exchange Commissions that have completely, they don't want publicly traded companies involved in their farming efforts.
Okay, thank you so much. And but Lars Dyrud, now we heard much about that. These are calculated figures, and you have to change practice in order to get your money out. But what if we measure the effect much more precisely, Lars Dyrud?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having myself and Earth Optics present and join this panel. We're really looking forward to it. And Martin and Jordan did a fantastic job of introducing some of the concepts associated with outcome-based as opposed to practice-based. And so at Earth Optics, we really saw a few years ago, there was a big issue. We're big believers in outcome-based for everything, but especially those related to farming. Farmers are really good at managing their operations on an outcome basis. They get paid for how much food they produce, not how they produce the food in most cases. And we think the same should apply to carbon for the most part, because we're going to get better results. Soil is, quite different from one location to the next, and farmers who've been operating on their land for, in many cases, generations, know how to manage that soil. And so when provided with data and accurate and high resolution data, they're going to continue to optimize their operations for not only food production, but also carbon production and carbon sequestration. So a big problem with the various carbon markets and carbon enterprises were that the cost for accurate soil carbon quantification in many cases exceeds the value of the carbon credit that might get issued. And so we wanted to solve that problem, not by avoiding measurement and introducing practice or model-based solutions, but say, what if we could maintain very high standards for accuracy when it comes to physical measurement and quantification of soil carbon, but dramatically lower the cost? So we invested in technologies that still use what is today considered the gold standard for quantifying carbon, and that is taking a soil sample and sending it to a lab. We wanted to preserve that methodology for getting the absolute measurements, but develop machine learning-based and other sensor-based methods that would allow us to extend the value of that costly soil sample over more hectares on a field. And so that's what I'm showing here. This is the process we introduced and implemented, and we've been now doing this for a little over a year and a half in the United States. And I think this fall will be probably verifying somewhere around 50% of the soil carbon credits in the United States using this system. And so the way it works is on the left side of your screen, you can see colored dots that represent soil samples for carbon concentration. This is 1,100 acres or about 300 hectares in Mississippi represented by these maps. And we took 36 carbon samples and 12 bulk density samples, both of which are needed to quantify total amount of carbon on a field. And so, but in addition to those soil samples, we also measured with a set of sensors carried on a vehicle, and we bring in elevation data and other satellite data sets. So then our soil samples are not just merely a soil sample and a poll of what's happening in that very one location on the field. It's now training data for a machine learning based model. And so we take all the data that's been gathered within a 10-meter radius of the soil sample and bring that in and use that to train and add to our machine learning model, which we then apply to all the sensor, elevation, and satellite data to produce an estimate for what the carbon values are or any other property that the system had been trained on across the entire field. And so what you see is the result of that process is this middle map I love showing this map. What's fantastic about it is you can actually make out rectangular shaped field boundaries here. You can see there's a diagonal line in this northern section. That's an area where the owner operator of this field had been applying soil amendments and conducting deep tillage. And then he stopped at that diagonal line. You can also see this yellow swoosh that comes from the eastern to the northern side. That's a high clay content soil type that tends to hold more carbon. And there's even a yellow ribbon here at the southern portion. That's this river down at the southern side of the map that floods pretty much every year, depositing dense silt and higher carbon content material. And so why I love this image so much is our system doesn't know anything about field boundaries. It doesn't know anything about tillage practices or soil types. So to see the impact of all those different effects on the carbon concentration levels represented in very detailed way lends a lot of credibility to how sensitive the system is to subtle changes in carbon. And so we think making investments and deploying technologies to still keep very high standards for how we quantify and measure carbon really is the key to soil carbon programs being successful in the future. I sometimes tell a joke that if I logged into my bank and they showed me a modeled balance, that would not be acceptable to me for very long. I'd really want to know actually how much money I have. And we think both the buyers and the producers of carbon want to know actually how much carbon they're producing, and they want to pay for it and get paid for it accordingly. And so we're big believers in using technology to lower the costs of, but yet keep accurate carbon quantification. And that's what we've been working on and deploying here in the market. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lars. And we are going quickly on to just Knauer, because how can these emerging technologies create data to make decisions for a better future using the carbon markets, for instance?
Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Knauer. I am a co-founder of Reseed. I'm also was just appointed to the World Economic Forum's to lead their effort on looking at next generation carbon measurement, specifically related to farms around the world. And my company focuses on the 2 billion farmers in the world that are smallholder farmers that own that are at or below the poverty level in the countries in which they reside, and basically are at the front lines of protecting against one of the biggest problems related to climate change, which is that 80% of deforestation in the world is due to the loss of smallholder farms and deforestation as a result of being overtaken by industrial agriculture. These farmers feed 70% of the world, and at higher percentages in individual countries. And basically what we are doing is at Reseed is a combination of things. We are publishing a new standard for how to actually measure and verify carbon at a very small level, at a micro scale on small farms. And our protocols are generating 2 new types of carbon credits in the markets, at the voluntary markets. One that deal with the issues that Jordan brought up earlier. One is a carbon protection credit, which measures the ongoing protection of carbon that exists on a farm year by year. It's a performance-based measurement, so we're looking at what happened last year. We are not involved in any of the future modeling stuff. We are not interested in what may happen in the future. We measure what actually happened last year. And then net new carbon that we measure over a series of years. Every year, once again, if there's net new carbon that we are measuring from our farmers, we issue a carbon removal credit, which is a pure measurement of carbon sequestration. And basically, we have a whole set of methodologies and a white paper that I don't have time to get into right now in my quick summary, and I apologize for the scientists among us. But basically, what we are then doing is taking each of those carbon, every metric ton of carbon that is being generated through either one of those 2 credits to market. And we are basically making all of this available openly in the marketplace. You can verify every piece of data that goes into our system and every bit of measurement that comes from our farmers, because we write all of our data to blockchain. And we make that blockchain publicly available so that people can actually, the buyers of carbon can actually see exactly where their carbon came from. And then we also provide several hundred other data attributes about social impact and socioeconomic impact of the carbon credits and the programs that we have in place. So just quickly to give you some numbers, we are currently have 8,700 farmers in Brazil that are part of our process. They all are at or below the poverty level in Brazil. And we've measured over the past year a total of 2 million metric tons that they are currently protecting on their land. And those 2 million metric tons of carbon are already now in market. And we are providing those carbon credits and selling those carbon credits to companies that are interested in both insetting. So they are buying the carbon from their own supply chain, which helps secure the supply chain. It helps them. We map that data from those credits against 9 different SDGs for their corporate reporting, and also provide, of course, the carbon verification for their carbon accounting practices that they need to use. One thing that's important to note is that our carbon credits, the protection credits, are selling at, I don't mean this as a sales pitch, but it's to deal specifically with the issue that Jordan brought up, which is totally accurate. Basically, our farmers make 50% of the gross sale of every carbon credit that's sold, and then an additional 30% of that sale goes to a local ag tech support organization that basically is working with these farmers on plans for how to incorporate more regenerative and traditional farming practices to increase the amount of carbon that they have in their plant, vegetation, and soil on their land. And our farmers right now in Brazil are doubling their annual household income as a result of the sale of these carbon credits. These are the most profitable activity that these farmers related to carbon can work with. And they are based, probably most based in transparency and actual science versus any other program that we are aware of. And basically what we are doing, this group that these 2 million metric tons from these 8,700 farmers is a test bed for us. We'll be launching this globally in countries that allow farmers to actually monetize ecosystem services. And we expect to be up at around 1 billion metric tons a year of carbon that we're measuring across millions of farmers around the planet. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more detail, of course, but I don't want to take up more time than I was allotted.
Thank you so much, Knauer. Now, Jennifer Hanser, Director of Business Development at Agrina, a doubling of income for farmers. That's quite a lot. Can you? You've been on Agrina, have been on the market a few years now, and have moved on to the US to enter the Wild West. Can you tell us about what your role is in the market and how you see the future for the carbon market?
Sure. So our role is to really accelerate the transition of regenerative agricultural at scale and provide access to farmers that need financing. And the carbon markets are one of the first markets that are emerging, that are actually rewarding farmers for participating in this transition. And as we've seen, the carbon markets as they exist today aren't perfect. The supply chains haven't really embraced them yet. And so we're looking at providing scalable solutions that work in the context of the voluntary carbon markets today, but also in the context of what the public sector and the supply chains are doing in the future, always representing the farmers' interests. And I think that you'll be able to see a little bit of that in that presentation today. Let me go ahead and run through it here. All right. So we really believe that accelerating the regenerative movement, it requires mobilization of the wider financial institutions and ecosystems. We need the banks, the pension companies, the insurance companies to get involved. And in order to mobilize that requisite financing from these players, we believe that technology is necessary to scalably provide both the knowledge to the farmers and the know-how of how to transition and how to avoid some of the pitfalls that are very real in this transition, and to provide the integrity that the market needs on the monitoring, reporting, the measuring of the carbon that's sequestered and these important actions that are taking place in the fields. We're over 100 professionals right now. When I started Almost a year ago, we were just under 50, so we're growing substantially, growing along with this movement. We're based in Copenhagen, and we're operating the program today in 13 European countries. So we know what it takes to operate in both large-scale and small-scale farming regions, and in different soil types and different crop types. We are very well funded and raising around currently. Farming is in our DNA. One of our co-founders comes from a farming family and has worked in the agricultural industry. The other co-founder came from technology, and our third co-founder came from the banking industry. But farming is squarely within our DNA. Most of our seed financing came from farming families here in Denmark. We launched a commodities trading program first to try to provide direct access to trading for the farmers of their commodities. And in 2020, looked at the emerging voluntary carbon markets and realized that that would be an important area for farmers to focus. And so we're helping them focus on their transition to regenerative farming and bringing them the financing that the carbon markets provide. We launched Agrina Carbon just last year with Harvest 2021. So the first vintage of our program was operated in 2021. We're now closing out the second year of our program, vintage 2022. We've raised a Series A that was $20 million US, led by Kinnevik, a large, prominent venture capitalist here in the Scandinavian region out of Sweden. And to scale what we're doing, we've recently acquired Hunting Technologies. They're a London-based technology company with a lot of the similar technology that Josh had mentioned, or sorry, that Lars had mentioned in some of the soil sampling and measurement that he's doing. What we actually do is measure a series of practices and calculate what is going on in the fields and in the air and in the soil. And so we look at the use of crop rotations, residue mulching, reduced tillage, use of organic fertilizers, and of course, changing the tillage practices. And with each of those different practices based on the region they're operating in, the soil type, the crop that's being farmed, we calculate what's going on in terms of both reductions and removals. And increasingly, we're measuring the actual soil. So we'll be taking thousands of soil samples all across Europe this year, and we'll be comparing that and modeling that against what we're seeing from a practice-based calculation. All of our program is transparent, it's verifiable, it's audited, it's traceable back to field level. Just like Josh mentioned, the use of blockchain is something that we're implementing this year as well, so that you can see exactly what has happened on every field that's in our program and what is going into producing those certificates. How it works for a farmer is that they join our program directly. There's other carbon certification programs that are working through third-party bigger ag players. We're actually working directly with our farmers. So they join, they give us their 5 years of historical field data. They tell us what they're going to do in the field going forward. And then at the end of the harvest, we actually take inventory of what happened in those fields. And we do that by actually visiting the farms of our farmers and looking at satellite imagery data, as well as looking for documentation that they can provide on what cover crop seeds they purchased, what machinery they're using. And on a practice-based level, we are looking at all of those activities and taking into account everything that would either reduce or remove carbon from the field and practices. And then with a third-party auditor, we are able to issue carbon certificates. And we are doing this today to the Verra standard. It's one of the leading voluntary carbon market standards that the buyers are embracing. And so we have created a program that is to the VM42 standard, which is the leading standard in the market today. Over 60% of the voluntary carbon markets are coming through Verra. And one reason why we've had such success is we're truly farmer-centric, and we give the farmers the flexibility and control in our program. They can decide if they want to enter 2 fields, 1 field, which fields they want to enter into the program. So it's not an all or nothing thing. And they can decide on each of those fields independently which practices to adopt. And ultimately, they can decide what to do with the certificate. So unlike other certification programs, we're not just giving them a payment, we're giving them the choice of having their certificates or going through us if they'd like us to sell those certificates and getting them a payment. And we believe that that flexibility is going to be critical as the supply chains start to get more interested in these removals and reductions and accounting for them in terms of their scope 3 emissions. And so we're really leaning in on the farmer side to provide that flexibility and control. You know, as Martin talked about, and Jordan talked about, this is critical financing that they need to be able to transition. And so we look at, you know, this type of a model, this type of a financial model and budgeting model in each region. You know, input costs are varying each year, and the amount that a farmer can earn based on soil type and based on crop type varies. And so we really try to model out what it's going to look like for the farmer in the near term and the long term to make sure that they're on the right path. And of course, there's benefits besides just the cash that we're providing and the carbon benefits. There's ecosystem benefits that we're also tracking. And you'll see on the next slide how we're doing that. And I think with our farmer-centric model, just in our second year, we've truly been able to show that this program can scale and that farmers will embrace it across all of Europe. We've grown 10x from our first year to our second year. We've had very supportive partners. We work with water utility companies in the UK that are rolling out our program to their farmers and helping us to measure the impact on water management. We're working with the leading manufacturers of machines that are helping farmers farm in a way that's less destructive to the soil and better for the environment. We work with the leading agronomists in each region, and it really is a region by region approach in terms of the agronomy of this transition. We work with large co-ops in various regions across Europe. So Danish Agro has a large presence across Europe, as well as Balam in Spain. We're very grateful that these partners across the ecosystem of the industry have really embraced us and brought us to their farmers. But we really need to accelerate things because 500,000 hectares is good, but we need to get growing even faster. And so we're really looking to leverage the scale and technology of the Hummingbird acquisition to provide services to both the supply chains and the public sector. You know, right now we're serving the carbon markets, but we really do believe that the rest of the industry is going to be critical to incentivize and push farmers in the right direction. And we're there to provide some technology to support that transition and to provide some financing that's necessary. Right now we have the monitoring and reporting capabilities that are very practice-based. So we're really measuring, but in the future, you'll see us doing a little bit more about what Lars mentioned in terms of the actual measurement and combining our data set in terms of what's happening on the fields and practices, marrying that up with the actual field soil sampling that we're doing. And we really believe that it's a huge challenge that we're facing and that we need more sectors involved, so it can't just be the farmers that are coming to the table. We really need the supply chains in the public sector. And that's what we are doing at Agrina.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I know Agrina is very well known in Denmark, and if you look at but it's different organizations go differently about it. We have two large farming organizations in Denmark. In one, the chair has already selling his carbon schemes using Agrina, and the other he does not and doesn't see it necessarily to be the way forward. So it's really interesting what will happen in the years to come. And now I'm very happy to invite Nick Sramek from Dune Insights to take over the scene. Dune Insights, Nick is bringing together innovation leaders and transformative startups to highlight key technology trends, kind of what we're trying to do here today. But please give us an insight to the work you do at Dune Insights. And just afterwards, Nick will lead a panel debate. I can put up the program for the debate after Nick's initial presentation, and then there'll be a panel discussion with today's speakers on the subject.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jacob. And I won't put up slides today, since the majority of my work is really not relevant to this discussion here on carbon markets, but just in short. So Dune Insights is a platform that takes a close look at early stage startups and recommends them to our investors and our network of corporates. So we work within the food and ag space, as well as climate tech, automobility tech, and other industries within innovation. So we're basically a funnel for early stage companies to help them achieve their goals, and we identify the most promising and help them get to where they need to be. So as we work closely with food and agriculture, obviously carbon credits and carbon markets is a big part of what we talk about, and we constantly see really interesting early stage companies come around in the US and around the world, such as Josh and Lars here, two wonderful founders that are doing some interesting things in that space. So I think I'll just leave it there, actually, in an interest of time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for the discussion. So I'd welcome us to begin that. So as Jacob said, we're just going to have a start a short conversation here on a few different issues around carbon markets. So Josh, Jennifer, Lars, Jordan, I welcome you all to jump in as we talk through these issues. I can direct questions at you in the Socratic method that we all hate, or as in the U.S. carbon markets method, I'll call for voluntary inclusion into the conversation. So feel free to jump in if anything here touches a nerve, or you want to clarify my poorly worded comments or anything like that. I'm happy to leave it to you to take it. So we had a few different topics that we wanted to discuss here, and I think all of them have been alluded to through these past presentations here. But we'd love to touch on the measurement side of things, as we mentioned, that a lot of work is being done on measurement and verification of carbon. Then we'll also touch on the regulatory challenges in the US and the EU, and what is being done and what's not being done in those areas, what can be done more. And we'll talk about the economics of carbon sequestration for farmers, what that looks like at the farmer level, and as far as a market making perspective, how are these markets being developed? So with that, I think we'll begin with the issue of measurement. And Lars, you began our conversation here on measurement, since that's what you focus on in part. So today's voluntary markets in the U.S. they lack the liquidity necessary for efficient trading, in my opinion. And this is partially due to these credits being highly heterogeneous. So while a lot of people are going into certain standards, like Jennifer mentioned, the Vera standard that accounts for 60% of the credits out there, it's still a very scattered market. And there's all these different voluntary market credit schemes that aren't necessarily in alignment. They're focused on the location of the project, the type of project, and it seems like that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make sure that we're all on the same page, and we have a single standard, or at least we hope that one day we get to a single standard. And so maybe Lars, I could start with you, and then I could turn to the others about this question of arriving at a single standard. Is that a goal that we should be looking to achieve? And if so, how would we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's probably so do many other people on this panel, but also elsewhere. I think my viewpoint on it is we shouldn't have a single standard for how to make measurements of soil carbon. So like I said, soil is very complex. It varies significantly from one region to the next. And we don't want to exclude technology, selfishly for one reason, but I think innovation can continue to drive down costs and drive up accuracy. And so What I do think we need is a standard for accuracy, and then have a methodology for how that's verified. And so so that way you can at least create consistent expectations on the veracity of various credits that are issued or various programs associated with the measurement. So right now, like you said, we got a real mix. But I think over the next years, we'll continue to develop various standards around how we arrive at certain accuracy. So I'm kind of hoping that we'll get to a place kind of like how bonds are traded, where you got a, A-rated bond, a B-rated bond. No one is prescribing per se how those companies manage their finances, but we have a single way of rating certain things regardless of the methodology that went into the overall rating. So hopefully there's a lot of development to come over the next few years.
Great. Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's two factors that we expect will drive liquidity and improve demand, and that is both what's happening in the public sector and what's happening in industry. And in the public sector here in Europe, we've got both the EU carbon program that is right now being developed and taking feedback from carbon programs like ourselves on what should be the new standard at the EU level. And we see in the UK that they're developing the soil carbon code, and we're part of a working group that is advising on that. And so we do expect that the public sector is leaning in, and there will be more regulation coming and more standards that are embraced and acknowledged from the governments. So I think that'll help things from a liquidity perspective, as well as the industry embracing the voluntary carbon market. So you see that Corsia actually has some VER projects that they are eligible to purchase, and you see different industry associations like the Real Estate Industry Association in the UK embracing both Vera and Gold projects. So we're starting to see enhanced liquidity and expect that will continue.
Great. Josh.
Yeah, I think it's important to get a bigger perspective here for a second. Basically, we need to understand during the time that carbon markets and carbon trading has been in effect for the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen a doubling of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've seen a doubling of deforestation in the world in the past 10 years. And we need to admit that what we're measuring, and we're all focused on very detailed measurements and proving it and all the rest, is probably the wrong thing. We are building upon this concept of additionality, that what might happen in the future and what could potentially, and building markets off of that, when we actually have, and we've heard about some of it today from Lars and others, the technology to look at what actually happened. And if we move to the concept of performance-based carbon credits, for example, whether it's nature-based or in other forms, we would likely be in a much better position to simplify the process, which is what needs to happen. We don't actually need more science thrown at this. We need a simpler process that more people can understand and that the markets can understand specifically, so that we can see an increase in demand and liquidity, of course, that would come from that. And then we also need more inclusivity. All of the standards that everybody has mentioned today, Vera, Gold Standard, and all of the others, exclude smallholder land participants for many different reasons, and I can get into that. But the point is, we don't really need big corporate farms to be doing more carbon farming. I mean, that'd be nice. What we need is actually where the food supply actually comes from in the majority of the world, which is not from these big industrial agriculture farms that we're talking about. Those farms are producing feed for animals. Most of the food that is produced in the world is done by smallholder farmers. There's 2 billion of them, farmers. There's 500 million of those farms that exist, and they are completely outside of the system. And I have a bias towards that, but we need more inclusivity. How do we get backyard gardeners involved in carbon farming? How do we get millions, billions of people around the planet engaged in this activity? And I can tell you, if we are talking about additionality, permanence, and all these other terms that don't actually make any sense when you look at the actual science of it, and when we're not, as Jordan earlier said, acknowledging the fact that we have billions of acres of land and forest in the world where you don't need net new activity to take place. You don't need to be measuring additionality, and you need to be looking at the ongoing work that has been happening on that land for hundreds of years, because of human either involvement or leaving it alone. We have to find ways to value that, and current systems don't do that effectively. And so these are all things that need to change in order for us to get to a sensible carbon market. And right now, honestly, we don't have that.
Yeah, wow, that's a great point, Josh, and or a set of points that I think we often lose sight of during this discussion when we're so focused on creating efficient markets that we lose sight of, well, what's the end goal in all of this? What are we actually trying to achieve? And if emissions reductions or reducing greenhouse gases is that, then that should be center of our mind when in all these discussions. That despite a lot of the messiness that this discussion often gets into. Heinzold, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to jump in here? Heinzold? Yeah, that's you. I think you are on mute. But,
Sorry, yeah, no, that's the name of my farm shop.
Got it.
No, it's a long story. I'll just quickly tell you who I am and what I do. I live and work here in Denmark. We have a small freehold farm in the north of Fyn where we produce Jersey beef. We have a small company where we have developed a CO2 certification system. And I wanted to ask the panel about an earlier question. We've been working with a report and with the World Resource Institute's Global Greenhouse Gas Protocols. And I was a bit curious to hear there's not been any mention of the World Resource Institute and the work that Jessica and her team did. Oh, I say her team, it was actually Timothy Suretchinger, if I pronounced that correctly, who produced the report for Denmark. We've been working on our program now for about 2 years, and I'd like to know from the panel what the overall where is this certification process going, and how is the greenhouse gas protocols, how are they being integrated into your different calculation and certification systems? And my name is Benjamin, by the way. Sorry about we do a very poor job of marketing our farm shop.
Thanks a lot for the question. So we had a couple hands up there. Did anyone want to respond directly to Benjamin? Jennifer, go ahead.
Yep. So very, very good point. It's fantastic to see that there's been development in both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Target Initiatives. And we believe that that development, especially what was announced in the past month, is really going to drive the supply chain and the agricultural supply chain into embracing regenerative transitions. And so we believe that there have to be standards that are accepted publicly in order for there to be wide acceptance and for everyone to be able to align around a certain direction. So we're really pleased to see that. And our program is evolving to be able to also align to the new GHG protocol. So I would say that you could consider the program as aligned today to the voluntary carbon market, which doesn't necessarily look at anything that's non-additional. And I think people have raised the issue already that that's something that might be a fault of the voluntary carbon markets, but we do believe there will be plenty of good reward that comes out of the next direction, and that will be focused on how to provide that acknowledgement that farmers are doing good for the environment, that they've been doing for the last 10, 20, 50 years, and that they continue to do, and that'll come out of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Target Initiatives.
Absolutely. Oh, Lars.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of echo some points that Josh made in terms of the concepts of additional and permanence. I think my personal opinion is that they're absurd for soil carbon. They may be appropriate for other carbon sequestration means, but if you take a step back, you've got 450 billion tons of carbon cycling into the terrestrial biosphere, including the soil, and about 444 billion tons coming out of it every year. And humans are emitting, 18 billion tons. And so that is swamped by the natural cycling of carbon through the air and terrestrial biosphere, of which the soil is a huge part of. And so nothing that you do regarding the soil or plants are permanent. And in measuring additional is a very, I think, sufficiently complicated concept. It makes it absurd for this process. I think what we really need to do is what Joshua is working on and indicating. We need to pay people who get a little bit better result every year. If we can get that, instead of 450 tons going in, if we can jack that up to 452 and keep it, instead of 444 going out, maybe 442, and pay people annually for each little contribution they make to just turning the dial a little bit on that in versus out cycling. But it's an ongoing practice that has to happen. It's not something that's permanent, really. So I think we need to pay for outcomes on a continuous and constant basis. And if we incentivize activity, we'll get, I think, long-term results, as opposed to paying for long-term results and expecting that you'll give somebody a payment and 100 years later it'll still be there. So that's my personal opinion, not necessarily any official opinion, but I just wanted to chime in on that particular topic.
Well, Lars, that's the good thing about being the head of your company. Your opinion is the official opinion, so you can just go with that. That's I think we have a lot to unpack there, but just in the interest of time, I wanted to move on a little bit to the markets themselves. So we've been speaking a lot about voluntary carbon markets and how they're working or not working in the US. I'd love to just talk about, is this the way forward? Is this really the best solution that we can do? Or should regulators and policymakers and companies be pushing for something that's national in the US or global to account for this in a better way? Josh.
Yeah, I think that basically it's going to be almost impossible. We, as the politics of this, both here in the United States and then certainly globally, it's very difficult for large groups of people to agree on, exact standards and things like that. That's been a problem that's plagued humanity for, a very long time. We can't agree on how to, build a railroad car the same size, right? So how are we going to do this? I think, though, that what can happen and what needs to happen is the concepts of carbon and what's associated with them there needs to be some very transparent, very clear sets of guidelines around, what forms of science are acceptable, what types of measurements can we be looking at, and then move beyond just carbon, because we need to understand that these activities are not about carbon. They're actually about ecosystems. They're about biodiversity. They're about people that live on the land. Just as an example, most of the nature-based carbon credits in the world, which are just, by the way, a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall carbon markets that are out there, are based on tree planting and reforestation efforts, not based on agriculture at all. I think it's 1% maybe comes from agriculture. So basically, when we're looking at tree planting, just as an example, billions of trees are the target for how many new rows of trees we need to be planting all over the place. We need to do in large scale, and those projects end up displacing and causing real estate speculation and displacement of local communities and indigenous people, just as an example. In other sides of the carbon market that are not other tree planting activities, about 60% of the world's nature-based, quote-unquote, nature-based carbon that's available in Verra certified and gold standard certified markets are coming from fossil fuel based projects. So, the largest coal mine in the world was dug and financed because they promised to plant some trees afterwards and didn't have to even account for the fact that all that coal is going to be going out into the atmosphere. So there's just so much activity that I think we can generally agree upon as principles. And set some basic guidelines for what is appropriate. And most of all, we have to agree on transparency. You should be able to track that carbon all the way back, exactly what methodologies were used, exactly where the carbon came from. And at the very, very least, open transparency allows much more eyes basically on these solutions and academic and scientific and community-based debate.
So you think that market-based mechanisms, including the use of tools like blockchain is the solution that really is what we're going to arrive at.
Yes, and please understand, I'm not some crypto wide-eyed person. Blockchain is an excellent distributed ledger technology that allows for immutability and the ability to publish transparently data. And so, we literally post every single transaction that takes place, from the writing from the app that our farmers use to data that they're writing. It goes all right directly to blockchain, all the way through the transactions and the payments back to those farmers. And basically that level of transparency, if there's other technologies in the future, great, but the concept of transparency is what needs to happen. And blockchain right now happens to be an excellent technology to be using for doing that for many reasons.
Giving blockchain a better name than it has in the past. Love it.
Yeah.
Jordan, love to have you hop in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as voluntary markets in the U.S., I don't see it going any other way, because the sentiment, I've spoken about this topic to 3,000 farmers across the U.S. now, and there is roughly the same sentiment on a negative connotation surrounding carbon programs, carbon markets. And they believe, well, my experience, most producers are wondering why companies are coming to them to generate carbon credits to offset their emissions, right? And why not, if there was some sort of formal regulation, why not it be on the emitters themselves rather than coming downstream to them? And so there's pushback right now on voluntary enrollment by producers, because they're starting to now see evidence. Well, why should I get rid of my carbon credits and ownership of my carbon? It goes back to 10 years ago, the whole idea around selling data at the farm level, right? It's like, okay, well, now that's mine. There's value to this. And what happens in the future if there is regulation where I have to prove that my activities are, quote, carbon friendly, carbon neutral, what have you, and now I've sold off my credits. And so there's that sentiment right now that is deep rooted in production, U.S. agriculture, into the clientele, that stakeholders that I deal with. I think for this market to develop, I agree with Josh. There has to be transparency, specifically in my experience around the cost of verification by what I'm calling the aggregators or middle companies within this. We're seeing this in other sectors of the U.S. Agricultural industry, specifically in the beef packing industry, as well as the vertically integrated space of broiler production, where there's no transparency on production costs at the industry level. And when that doesn't exist, farmers are now questioning whether they're getting their fair share of the value of whatever product they're generating, which is now, I'm getting the question at every meeting that I do is, well, how much are they selling these carbon credits for? Because they believe they've been lied to on what percentage of the share of the carbon credit they generate, because in some of these contracts, they get, yes, it may be a percentage, but there's some cost in there that they don't know exist, right? And I can't tell them what, Microsoft or Google or whatever buying these credits for, because I don't know. What I can tell them is how much they're going to be offered. And there's just not the transparency along the supply chain, or maybe the blockchain would help that, provide that transparency. And I'm 100% for that, because, in almost every instance in production agriculture, right, the farmers are on the short end of the pricing, and they feel it, they see it, and why volunteer to a program where I'm not going to get the value, let alone the values not covering my expenses. And what happens in 10 years when all of these corporate pledges that are voluntary either disappear or they now hit, and it's that time to be net neutral, and the demand increases at the corporate level, which will hopefully drive up prices, right, to generate credits. And so they've got this mindset, and rightfully so, given the current structure of the programs involved here. And so
that's unfortunate that the water has already been tainted to a certain extent.
100%. And again, because this isn't a new concept, right? We had a lot of our farmers have signed up for these carbon programs back in the 90s, right? And what happened to that market? That market was based solely on a hope for a compliance-based system that was structured after the sulfur emission standards. And that the government change parties, it wasn't as a priority for the next administration during that time frame, and it went away, and all of that formal compliance-based markets collapsed. And so they've been there, seen it, and now it's repeated in a different fashion. And so they're very wary about what's going on. But then again, they're also angry, because they've been doing these environmentally friendly practices for years, and they're like frustrated. And a lot of my efforts have been in educating not only producers, but those that can make policy or can make changes so that these early adopters are not left out in these markets. And it's, why not get paid for doing what they've been doing for 50 years in the US and a lot of these other carbon markets, especially in the forestry, timber industry, right? There's perfect examples of making payments to defer harvest, right? We've got the same example that can be basically transferred over to row crop agriculture to say, okay, how about we not pay a farmer to till for the year, right?
I think a technology trend that is specifically that, Jordan, you're talking about, that the technology can help with, is to disintermediate this entire marketplace. And it's happening, by the way, on supply chain side of farming as well. I'm working with a collective of farmers in India. It's 20,000 farmers that have eliminated 15 layers of middle people to the end sellers, the end buyers of their product, right? Mm-hmm. Carbon markets can actually help much more. And we are doing this right now, and others are too, where basically the large corporations that are buying product directly, when we're doing insetting, we're directly connecting them to those farmers. The farmers are selling, they own their own carbon, they own their own carbon data, and they're selling it directly to those corporations. And when you can do that, then the conversation goes to, with insetting right away, oh, the cacao that you have that I want to buy, I'm currently paying X dollars or whatever per ton. What if we just bought it directly from you, as opposed to going through all these intermediaries? The company ends up paying the same price for cacao. The farmer ends up potentially tripling their income as a result of that happening. And if we are not talking about disintermediation and looking at, once again, where, the ability to scale this to billions of people and farmers and all the rest, honestly, we're working on the wrong problem. And if people are applying massive amounts of technology, increasing overhead, and honestly scaling slowly, we're not going to turn around climate change. And I'll stop talking because I know others want to speak.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate that. Lars, go ahead and hop in.
Yeah, so I think actually when it comes to regulation, there's a couple points that are brought up. The issues Jordan brings up are clear. That's probably why annual-based programs are really the solution, not these long-term additional commitments. But I think we can have a lot to learn from how the organic movement shook out. I don't know if people recall, but organics was a completely private, voluntary thing. Every company was deciding to call whatever they were doing organic for at least 10 years. And so the USDA in this particular case, and the regulatory authorities in Europe did similar things, where they just watched it all play out for a while. got smart, and then very carefully and meticulously went around and decided to set a standard for what it meant to be organic and what you had to do for every single food category to call it organic. I think that hopefully the carbon world will shake out the same way. And I think actually even through the food ingredients is probably where it's successful. It's food ingredients are produced on an annual basis or temporary basis anyway. And ultimately, if the USDA and similar regulators set a standard on what you have to do in order to claim carbon benefit, you can start attaching that to the food ingredients and sell those along with the market. So that benefits the growers directly, disintermediates, like Josh is pointing out, all these other carbon players. And so if we just put the carbon score like an organic label onto the food, then it can be sold together with the food. It can be separated from the food and used for whatever use cases you want. So I hope that's how the world's going to shake out, and we're kind of pushing people whenever we get a chance to go that way. So I think it'll be very interesting over the next 10 years.
Yeah. So, but before we turn over there, I mean that's a really interesting point. And the organics market developed because there was there was a market in place for it. There was demand from consumers for this product, and so because of that demand, farmers were incentivized to switch to organic, and then the USDA had to come in turn to identify what that is. The hope is the same here, right? Is that there's that the demand continues to grow, and so similar to ESG in the investment space, that 10 years ago, if you said ESG to someone, they thought you were talking about a recreational drug, and now it's something that BlackRock invests billions of dollars into, and it's something real, and it's something that is being measured and is on annual reports of the largest companies in the world, and that has created the change. It isn't necessarily a regulatory body that identified what ESG is. It's this demand that comes from consumers, and then corporations follow.
Can I jump in here? Because I think this analogy with the organic sector, I think is really interesting. But I think also we have a very different history in Denmark and also in Europe with respect to the whole development of the organic market that started out more as a regulatory process and standardization. And then that sort of formed the basis of the market development. So we didn't really have this bottom-up process beforehand, but it was much more guided by the regulatory standards that was developed already in the middle of the 80s in close collaboration with the organic sector, but it was more policy-driven in a sense. And I think that the whole carbon farming sector is. I'm a little afraid that there's too many initiatives that are experimenting with carbon farming and also investing in particular ways of organizing these carbon markets, and then it will be quite difficult to standardize this afterwards, because they will have too difficult approaches to standardizing and to monitoring, reporting, and verification, and then it's It may be difficult to standardize afterwards, but I think it will be important to have more of a planned process, so that we have some more joint guidelines for how we can organize these types of markets. And also, we haven't talked much about the consumers, but I think the consumers and their trust in this system is completely fundamental if we want to bring in some funding for these types of initiatives towards the end. And if there's too much of a Wild West in this certification side, then we easily end up losing all credibility of the carbon farming. So we need some sort of level playing field for how these schemes can operate, and also what can actually count for a carbon removal. And I don't think it's necessarily a problem that we don't have permanent sequestration in the agricultural and food sector, because we won't get to that. And for an economic reason, it's also beneficial for the farmers that carbon is degrading, so that they can contribute nutrients and all of that. But we need some sort of a process for how long we can actually sequester carbon and how we monitor and verify these contributions.
Yeah, I think you need continuous incentives, and you'll get long-term results with continuous incentives applied, but trying to create a permanent requirement is so difficult. I often joke, like, there's no permanent incentive for oil, yet it somehow just keeps coming out of the ground and ending up in the atmosphere. And so, because there's a continuous incentive, right, that's applied. And so if we can do the same thing in reverse with soil and terrestrial carbon, hopefully we'll get the same results.
And Martin, I think part of the problem that you speak to is are the peculiarities of the U.S. marketplace, and how we, how our focus on capitalism sort of drives just a kind of a winner takes all approach, almost, where you have everyone is able to put their technology out there, or their plan out there, and then the market chooses the winner. And within ag tech in the United States, it's even worse. I mean, farmers in the United States, they're inundated every day with hundreds and hundreds of unique plans that technologists and others that are saying, we can help improve your efficiency, or your topsoil, reduce your topsoil reduction, or anything else, and then they have to, on their own, choose which of these plans make sense for their farms. And it's overwhelming for farmers, and a lot of them really dislike this process of just everyone comes to them with an idea, and they have to decide which one is best. So the issues there as well. Jennifer, love to bring you back in.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm much more optimistic on the voluntary carbon markets, and I believe that a lot of the issues of the past, that have been raised today, are being acknowledged. And I think, while John Oliver's segment was true, it was true about the voluntary carbon market of yesterday. And we're really truly seeing mobilization of financial resources that are required for farmers to transition coming in, quadrupling from 2020 to 2021. The voluntary carbon market is now over $2 billion. So it's really picking up steam, and it's picking up steam because we're addressing some of the challenges that existed over the last 10 years. We're addressing the issues of integrity with more traceability and blockchain. We're introducing more standardization. There are leading standards that are starting to get the traction. So over 60% of the market aligned around Vera. And no, they're not perfect, but we really do see some step changes that are addressing some of the pain points. And I think that, as my Danish colleague here raised the point of the GHG protocol and the science-based target initiatives, we believe that that is also going to provide a standardization in how supply chains are accounting. And then when you give the farmers the access to the financing that's available, and you give them the control to decide how they want to use those certificates, how much financing they want from the voluntary carbon market, or as an incremental premium on their per ton price of a soft commodity, that's when things can really start to scale and work for both the farmers and the environment. I'm very optimistic of what we're seeing.
I like to hear a little optimism once in a while. Benjamin, you have your hand raised here, and maybe I could ask you to, since you are a farmer in the EU, and you have experience on the other side of this issue that Jordan was talking about farmers being totally frustrated with the process and skeptical of it. Maybe you could speak to your own experience and what the EU has done right to persuade farmers that this is a worthwhile objective.
It's interesting you should mention frustration, because I've been sitting here getting extremely frustrated, and I've written down a whole list of notes because it was Jordan's point I wanted to refer back to. So we acquired after quite a long period of conversion. We acquired our organic status in 2019, and we completed our Scope 3 conversion in 2020. So the transition to organic farming was considerably more difficult than putting together our first Scope 3 analysis and transition to carbon neutral activities. But that's just an aside, really. My question really, it's based on Jordan's initial statements, and it's actually directed really at Martin, but bringing in some of the things that Lars mentioned as well, and also Josh. And this is when we finished our Scope 3 transition, we sent all of our research or our report to Professor Ivan Olsen at the Organic Agricultural Department at Aarhus University. Sorry, that's my Danish English not being very good. And Martin, Professor Olsen mentioned a lot about double bookkeeping and how to control the actual sequestration of carbon at the individual farm level. And Josh mentioned a little bit about having a transparent blockchain solution. And Jordan mentioned that in America, they don't seem to have some sort of regulated pricing structure. I was wondering if this report that Professor Olsen has published, whether that's actually being evolved by the academic community to bring together some sort of standardized, once this carbon credit has been sequestered and it's been verified via blockchain or whatever kind of technology, that it's secured in the marketplace as a single guaranteed unit with a specific international price that can't be modified by other organizations or by other what would you call that, other players in the market trying to accumulate carbon credits in a less honest way. Maybe that's kind of the whole question, if it makes sense. Sorry if it was a bit messed up, but I was getting quite frustrated waiting for my turn to speak, so I'll be quiet now.
Does anyone want to address Benjamin's question directly?
What exactly was the question?
Yeah,
rephrase it on top of that.
Simply speaking, the question is, from what I've heard the panels talk about, there was no mention of this securing and guaranteeing internationally in a kind of unified way, some sort of single bookkeeping process, so that nobody can trade, I suppose, or exchange a credit or a carbon sink of the.
No.
Nope.
May have frozen.
Sales.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Benjamin, you froze a bit, but I think we got the nature of your question. Josh, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so this is an area, once again, I think that blockchain, and once again, doesn't have to be the only solution, but blockchain provides an ability when you can attach a digital contract to your carbon credit, which is something that is enabled within blockchain. And that is a unit of measurement of a metric ton of carbon. And if people agree, that that's valuable, then basically your production status of that carbon is permanently attached to that credit. And basically in our marketplace and others, when there are transactions that happen on chain, as it's called, and recorded that way, the contract is attached to the credit from day one through the entire lifespan until it is retired. And so what that can mean, in our world, for example, there is no variability. On our marketplace, there's no variability. There may be day-to-day market fluctuations, but there is one price for carbon of a specific type of credit and another price for another internationally, and it doesn't matter. That may mean that if you can buy carbon cheaper somewhere else, people may choose to do that. But I believe technology is moving towards the ability basically to do that traceability and to actually have e-contracts and what are called smart contracts attached to your carbon credit, so that no matter where it's sold, you always are able to see the transaction, understand what percentage of it that you're entitled to, and any other types of conditions that you want to put in it. But from our perspective, whether it's a carbon credit generated in Brazil or Malawi or India, it's always sells for the same price. There is no difference based on where the source of it came from.
Interesting. Jordan, I see your hand raised. Love your thought on this as well. Oh, I think he left. was about to speak and then he left. We'll return to him in a second. We have a
So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
There we go. Sorry, I had it off mute and I'll turn it on before trying to answer your question directly. As far as my experience with verification and the science behind that, there's a lot of players involved, and I don't think there's any movement towards an international standard like the research that the gentleman that you mentioned, where you sent your information. I have not heard of that study, nor in the community that I run in, the soil scientists. They all acknowledge it, just like it's been mentioned, that soil is a dynamic environment, right? And so it's very difficult to measure and standardize and all that. So I think we're still trying to figure it out. But as far as methodology for measuring, everyone's still doing their own thing. If that makes sense.
The unfortunate state of the markets. We'll maybe move on to a couple other questions here. I see we have some hands raised. Tom, do you have something you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I was inspired a little bit by Josh and by Martin, because I think also, Josh, what you were saying, that what is it all about? What is it that we want with this? And Martin was saying something about the consumers. And I'm surprised that we are following this track of taking out a segment in a product and are trying to sell out some very, very difficult, measurable parts of a product cycle from a life cycle of a product. Because when we do that, we have to take it out when we measure what, for instance, a kilogram of beef meat or a kilogram of pig meat or an avocado or whatever is produced before it gets consumed by the consumer, which is what it's all about. So we are getting complete confusion instead of focusing on that. What we need to produce products with as low a carbon emission as possible, and we need to also of course focus on getting as much carbon utilized by producing our products, because it's just as good to increase the consumption of carbon as it is to reduce the emission.
Well, Tom, I mean, all very important points.
Yeah. Let me just finish because I think life cycle analysis on products are the only way forward, because we need the consumers to understand how much effect a certain product, whether it's a food or it's a t-shirt or whatever, has had on the emission, and that is the way forward. And before we start to get that into the blockchain technology or whatever, and get that done, we will not reach anything at all. I could start plowing tomorrow and then make that as a baseline for my future emission reduction. It is completely crazy that we do not have any baselines, and all this confusion will just damage our goal, in my opinion. Sorry to say so.
Well said. And I think Josh would agree to this, at least, that we shouldn't necessarily separate these two goals of creating carbon markets to incentivize corporations in a variety of different industries to pay for their emissions, and the emissions associated with the growth of food, right? I think in many instances we look at these as two separate issues, but they shouldn't be. In many ways, they should be incredibly connected. But I think we tend to see these as separate. Lars?
Yeah, I will add, I do think in some cases we can identify soil carbon as somewhat separate. Of course, it's part of a life cycle analysis for every single product that's grown or grazed on that hectare. But their life cycle analysis can be complicated and also hard to enforce. Whereas I think there's a simplicity in soil carbon that if we can continue to educate the consumer that carbon can be in the soil or it can be in the air, those are the two places that exchange. And if we're being very careful, and we need to learn how to manage our soil more sustainably anyway. It's set, we have to learn we have to stop having soil be an emitter of carbon and turn it over to be a sequester of carbon. So I am a proponent of treating soil somewhat separately of total life cycle analysis because it is so directly measurable and so easy to communicate to others on that there's a ton of CO2 in the soil that used to be in the air, and next year there's another ton, or we lost a ton and we got to figure out how to put it back. I think because it's such a simple number and it can only be in one of those two spots, it lends itself to a convenient way of communicating with consumers across a broad range of products. So that's just my little pitch for soil carbon as kind of its own separate thing.
Yeah. And Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just say that I don't think we can underestimate the complexity of the global supply chain in agriculture. And so while it's great to be able to have a very direct, disintermediated supply chain for certain areas of the world or certain types of crops, the reality is that it's, especially when you're dealing with commodities, it's complex. And then the calculations of how to measure soil carbon and how to account for the soil carbon that's removed and reduced is complex. And so we're definitely seeing more and more trends that are helping to counteract some of the complexity, including the GHG protocol and SBTIs and the standardization of these soil carbon programs. So I think that we're headed in the right direction to try to wrangle with a lot of this complexity that just is what it is. And I think, again, I'm super positive and optimistic about where we're headed, especially as we start to get a handle on that complexity. And I think the problem that we're going to face in the future is something that maybe the music industry and the art world has faced, is how do you make sure that the originators, the farmers of the benefits that go into the supply chain or that get sold on the voluntary carbon market receive the continual, I call it a royalty stream, as that carbon credit gets traded in the secondary market. So we know, just quadrupling last year to 2 billion, it's going to go on an even steeper trajectory as we head to 2030. Those carbons that are being produced today want to make sure that the farmers receive and participate in the upside of where the market is going. And I believe that some of the technology that Josh is introducing to the carbon markets, these smart contracts, are going to be able to power that type of transparency and that type of reward and recognition back to the original originator. And I think it's a good problem to have, and there's new technology that'll be there to support.
Jordan, did you want to respond to Tom's points there before we move on?
Well, I mean, I think there's two things. I think there is complexity around life cycle analysis and getting even the general consumer to understand that concept when buying a product. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, because it's a question that I'm getting at the farm level and wondering myself, is, we've been strictly focused on carbon sequestration and the practices at the farm level that sequester carbon, right? But to me, that's a very narrow focus when thinking about the practices that are being paid for in the grand scheme things of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So in the US, we're paying farmers to adopt no-till, or paying producers to plant cover crops to sequester carbon, making that payment. However, completely ignoring the fact that if you plant cover crops before corn, you're going to have to put down 20% more nitrogen on the soil that can potentially go into the atmosphere. Also, if you plant cover crops, you have to terminate them somehow. And until glyphosate and all of our herbicides become greenhouse gas neutral, right? We're very narrow focused on the carbon sequestration side of things and making those payments while ignoring the other factors along with production agriculture that influence greenhouse gas emissions. So until we get that figured out, I have a feeling we're not gonna reduce greenhouse gas emissions until we figure out the complete system, because it's not going to work until these products and methods of production are addressed holistically. I'm baffled still on how we in the U.S. these programs are ignoring those issues, or don't want to touch it because we're so focused on payments on carbon sequestration, which is fine, but you're missing the big picture of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so I challenge the community in the U.S. globally to look at these issues from a production standpoint in a holistic manner and understand production agriculture and how it works, right? Oftentimes these programs are being offered to producers that don't understand production agriculture, small scale, large scale, period. And so, again, I just encourage us to think about this at larger scale, because we may just be, we may be missing it, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, good point. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Bjarne Andersen, hop on in.
Yes, if a farmer discovered that he has sold too many of his CO2 equivalents, is it possible that he can buy some of them back? If it's possible, I think there will be more farmers who are selling the CO2 equivalents.
So, yeah, Jennifer, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very good point. There's many carbon programs that are actually just taking the rights to the benefits, whether they be biodiversity or carbon benefits, and just paying the farmer. And then the farmer, can't account for his own emissions, or if the supply chain, Cargill or ADM, is looking to buy the commodity that he's producing, but pay a premium to and take those benefits through the supply chain, then the farmer's out of luck. So we do believe that carbon certification programs, they need to empower the farmer and give that farmer the control over the certificate. If he has sold his certificate in advance of maybe understanding where the market is headed or what his supply chain counterparty needs are, then I think that's a risk that we're trying to mitigate by actually involving the supply chain now in the conversations. And again, we believe that GHG protocol and science-based target initiatives are going to start to align all the different stakeholders that have an interest in these benefits that are being created on the fields by farmers.
Good. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. Benjamin, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to say one last thing before?
Very quickly. Tom and Bjarne, we are developing a system right now that supplies you with the needs that you have just mentioned. So keep posted, and very soon you'll be introduced to our system, which will provide you with the needs that you are mentioning. So I'm really pleased with this, guys. I'm really excited to meet you all, and I'm working really hard. And yeah, cool.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for taking part in this discussion. It's 35-40 minutes is just not enough time to go through all of what we need to go through. It's an incredibly complex topic with lots of different nodes, and it's hopefully this is the first of many, because I think just the people that are on this call and have contributed to the conversation are essential voices to moving this forward. So thank you again for listening and for participating in the discussion. And Jakob, happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick, for taking care of this question and answer session. And I'm really glad to hear that everybody participated as they did. Voices were heard from all over. Thank you for that. At Farmbrella Group, we mean to enable change in agro by gathering the brightest minds of the sector worldwide. And today we succeeded. So thank you for that. This video and will be put on the landing site used to enter this masterclass in the first place. We will also, in a few days, put on a community site, so you'll actually be able to write with each other afterwards. And you'll be sending an email by the address, the email address you used when approaching this masterclass. So hopefully we'll keep on talking online at the Farmbrella website at our community. I'll be happy to give you a link tomorrow, hopefully. And now I would very much like to pass on the word to Patricia Dahl from the American Embassy in Copenhagen, who made all of this possible. So the final words are yours, Patricia.
Thank you, Jakob. Well, my name is Patricia, and I work at the commercial section of the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen. And I just wanted to take a moment to first and foremost acknowledge our expert speakers today. Thank you for sharing your expertise, passion, experience, and the newest technologies with us all, and the exchange of the ideas and answers and questions was wonderful to witness. So thank you so much. I also wanted to thank Jakob and Farmbrella for great collaboration on this event, and wanted to give a shout out to my overseas colleague and the global team lead for commercial and trade specialists covering agribusiness portfolios, Greg Thompson, for his support and his rooting for us in our endeavors, this one and any future ones. I also wanted to thank all the participants for insightful questions during the Q&A session. I did not expect it to be this dynamic, so thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to witness, and I truly hope that this was useful to you all, and I wanted to encourage you to keep an eye on upcoming events. We are looking to organize similar master classes on different subjects in the future, so stay tuned. And I just wanted to say a brief word about the U.S. Commercial Service. We work with U.S. companies to determine the best markets for their products and services, help them evaluate international competitors, identify and comply with legal and regulatory issues when exporting, provide matchmaking services and industry overviews in local markets. So please let us know if we can be of any assistance. Let us know by contacting your local U.S. Export Assistance Center or the commercial team at the U.S. embassies. And for international companies, we also help facilitate business investment in the United States. So if you're looking to establish a presence in the US, open an office or a manufacturing facility, feel free to contact us at the US Embassy, and we'll be happy to provide assistance on anything from understanding basic US tax and legal concepts to information on navigating federal rules and regulations, to incentives available to businesses in different US locations. So with that, thank you once again, and I guess I will just turn it over to Jakob for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you all for joining. And as Patricia said, we have talked about during future meetings on maybe on different topics. But do feel free to contact either Patricia or me if you have a subject you think that we are to bring out worldwide, or at least across the Atlantic. So thank you very much, and have a good day and good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you.